Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Have you ever thought about how many times the wizarding world almost got exposed to Muggles? What if the magical secrecy wasn't as airtight as the Ministry of Magic wanted us to believe? In today's video, you will find out about the moments in the Harry Potter series when Muggles should have discovered the truth. One of the most magical aspects of Dear Harry Potter is, surprisingly, the magic itself. Wizards have spent centuries hiding their existence, crafting countless spells and enchantments to keep their world secret. And yet, throughout the books and films, we've seen multiple incidents that should have set off alarm bells for Muggles. From flying humans to disappearing walls, these moments defied logic, and somehow no one noticed. Let's take a closer look at the times when Muggles should have figured it all out. Aunt Marge. When Harry lost his temper and inflated Marjorie Dursley into a human balloon, the situation was neatly handled. Her memory was wiped, and Harry faced no real consequences. But even if the Ministry acted fast, someone in Little Whinging must have seen a woman floating through the sky. Imagine the local gossip. A screaming, airborne woman drifting above the rooftops. That's not something people forget easily. The Night Bus. Stan Shunpike insisted that Muggles couldn't see the triple-decker night bus, which made it the perfect wizarding transport. But while it might have been invisible, it certainly wasn't silent. In the movies, we see the bus crashing through the streets, narrowly avoiding cars, and making objects move in its wake. How could no one have noticed a high-speed, sound barrier-breaking force tearing through London? Owls swarm on Privet Drive. One of the most iconic scenes in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone was when dozens of owls bombarded the Dursley home, delivering letter after letter. Even if Muggles didn't immediately think magic, wouldn't a massive flock of owls acting strangely in broad daylight cause some suspicion? News headlines should have read, "Owl invasion shocks suburb." Platform 934. Sure, the Ministry of Magic has people stationed to wipe memories if needed, but how often can they really do that? King's Cross Station is packed with people, and Hogwarts students rush at a brick wall one after another. How is it possible that not a single Muggle ever noticed? Are we really supposed to believe that in all these years no one ever turned their head at the wrong moment? The vanishing snake. The first time we see Harry's magic in action, he unwittingly speaks to a snake and makes the glass of its enclosure disappear. The zoo crowd panicked, but what happened after? Where were the obliviators? Muggle authorities must have asked questions. How did the glass vanish? How did a boy end up inside the exhibit? Someone should have put two and two together. Ministry of Magic entrance. Wizards enter the Ministry through various methods, but one of them is particularly bizarre, flushing themselves down public toilets. Think about it. A regular restroom in the middle of London with people walking in it and never walking out. How long before a janitor or a regular office worker starts asking questions? Apparition. Apparition is an incredible way for wizards to travel, but it's a nightmare for maintaining secrecy. Wizards literally vanish into thin air and reappear somewhere else. The movies made it even clearer. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione escaped Bill and Fleur's wedding, they apparated right into a crowded city street. Hundreds of people should have seen them materialize out of nowhere, and if it happened once, it must have happened many times before. For all their efforts to stay hidden, wizards have left behind a trail of suspicious incidents. So, is the wizarding world truly a secret? Or have Muggles just been looking the other way? The enchanted Ford Anglia soared through the sky, defying gravity and all logic of the Muggle world. Harry and Ron, wide-eyed with excitement and panic, gripped the seats as the car veered over the British countryside. This wasn't some quick, unnoticed, magical maneuver. They flew high above roads teeming with cars, skimmed rooftops, and nearly crashed into the Hogwarts Express itself. Any Muggle who happened to look up that day should have had quite a story to tell, yet, curiously, no such reports appeared in Muggle newspapers. No evening news anchor gravely announced, "Mysterious flying car spotted over England." No frantic interviews with bewildered drivers who swore they saw a blue Ford hovering above the highway. How could that be? The Ministry of Magic was powerful, but could they really cover up something this public? The chaos began at King's Cross. Platform 934 had sealed itself, leaving Harry and Ron stranded. Panic set in. The clock was ticking. Then Ron had an idea, his father's flying car. It was supposed to be a family secret, a fun magical invention. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Without hesitation, they threw their trunks into the back seat and took off. At first, everything seemed like an adventure. The exhilaration of flying freely, the wind rushing through the windows, the sight of London shrinking below them. Ron laughed, gripping the wheel. "This is brilliant!" But soon the weight of their decision sank in. They weren't invisible. The car, shimmering under the afternoon sun, stood out against the blue sky. Muggles were everywhere, down below, on the roads, in their homes, looking up, squinting against the sunlight. Someone must have seen them. The motorway stretched endlessly beneath them. Cars zoomed forward, their drivers oblivious to the magic unfolding above. Then disaster. The engine sputtered, the car wobbled. Ron clutched the wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I don't like this, Harry." The Ford lurched downward. Below, a red lorry honked as they dipped dangerously close to the road. A businessman in a sharp suit, sipping his coffee, glanced up through his sunroof and nearly choked. His cup slipped from his fingers, spilling onto his lap. "Bloody hell!" His car swerved slightly before he corrected it. Surely he couldn't be imagining things. A flying car? Nonsense! He must be exhausted. In another vehicle, a young girl in the back seat pressed her face against the glass. "Mummy, a car's in the sky!" Her mother, distracted by traffic, barely glanced up. "Don't be silly, darling." But the girl knew what she had seen. She whispered to herself, "A blue car, flying." Further down the road, a retired pilot sat in his convertible, enjoying the summer breeze. His sharp eyes, trained by decades in the Air Force, caught something unusual, a flash of blue. He squinted, following its trajectory. His heart pounded. It couldn't be. He reached for his phone, but by the time he raised it, the car had vanished into a cloud bank. His hands trembled. Had he really seen it? Would anyone believe him? The Ford wasn't just visible. It was loud. Its engine roared, its tires occasionally spinning uselessly in mid-air. When Ron lost control, it swerved dangerously, knocking tree branches and sending birds scattering. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming red serpent of a train, chugged steadily along the tracks below. Inside, students chatted, laughed, and read their spellbooks. Then someone gasped, "Look!" A fourth-year Ravenclaw pressed her nose against the window, a flying car right above them. Her friend, a skeptical Slytherin, rolled his eyes. No way. But then he saw it too. Gasps rippled through the train. Heads turned, hands pointed. Draco Malfoy, sipping pumpkin juice, smirked. Potter. Even the conductor saw it. His job was to ensure the train reached Hogwarts safely, but what he saw through his window nearly made him drop his clipboard. He turned to his assistant. "Did you see that?" The younger man hesitated. I think so." A moment of silence passed before the older wizard sighed. Better report this to the ministry. And that was the key difference. Wizards might have recognized the enchanted Ford Anglia for what it was, but Muggles. To them it was impossible. And when people see the impossible, their minds often reject it. Perhaps some convinced themselves it was a trick of the light. Perhaps others blamed fatigue. And for those who truly believed their eyes, well, that's where the ministry came in. Obliviators were experts in erasing memories, smoothing over magical incidents so that Muggles never suspected a thing. They would have had their hands full that day, scouring roads, offices and train stations, finding those who had glimpsed the impossible. A light tap of a wand, a muttered incantation, and the memory of a flying car faded like mist in the morning sun. Still, it couldn't have been perfect. Some stories slipped through. A tabloid newspaper ran a ridiculous headline. Alien technology? Flying Ford spotted near London. A talk show host laughed as he read the claim aloud. "All right, folks, who's been drinking too much butterbeer?" The audience chuckled. The idea was absurd. A flying car? Come on. Even years later, whispers remained. The retired pilot still wondered if he had been right. The little girl, now older, sometimes recalled the summer afternoon when she saw a car in the clouds. The businessman still told his friends about the weirdest thing he ever saw on the road. But in the grand scheme of things, these were just stories, nothing concrete, no evidence. Back in the wizarding world, the Ford Anglia's journey didn't end gracefully. It crashed into the Whomping Willow, suffering dents and scratches before escaping into the Forbidden Forest. It became a legend among Hogwarts students, a feral car lurking in the shadows, waiting. It had a life of its own now, free from the constraints of Muggle roads and ministry regulations. For all their magic, wizards often underestimated Muggles. They relied on secrecy spells and memory charms. But maybe the biggest reason the magical world stayed hidden wasn't because of magic at all. Maybe it was because deep down, Muggles refused to believe. When faced with something that shattered their understanding of reality, they dismissed it. They called it a dream, a trick, a mistake. That's the real magic, isn't it? The ability of the human mind to look directly at the unbelievable and decide it never happened. The night air was crisp, the stars flickering high above Little Whinging, a quiet suburb. Nothing ever happened here. Streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves, until, roaring like a beast unleashed, came a monstrous, enchanted motorcycle, tearing through the sky. Hagrid's arrival was anything but subtle. The massive man, with his wild beard and thick coat, sat astride a flying motorcycle, one hand gripping the handlebars, the other cradling a tiny baby wrapped in blankets. The engine rumbled, its deep growl reverberating through the rooftops. Even the stillest night couldn't have swallowed that sound. Mrs. Fig, the peculiar old lady who lived just a few houses away, twitched her curtains. She had been watching over Harry from a distance, but even she wasn't expecting this. Through her thick glasses, she glimpsed a shadow zooming past. She blinked, stepped back. Surely not. It had to be a trick of the moonlight. On another street, a man leaned against his car, fumbling for his keys. He froze as a powerful gust of wind blasted through, rattling his newspaper. He looked up. For a split second, he saw something impossible, a hulking figure astride a machine, soaring above rooftops. He gasped, dropping his keys with a clatter. High above, Hagrid grinned, adjusting his grip on the baby. "Hold on tight, little fella. Won't be long now." The motorcycle dipped, then shot forward, tearing through the night sky. Below, windows rattled, street dogs howled. In a dimly lit apartment, a boy sat at his desk, doodling in his notebook. His radio played softly, mixing with the hum of nighttime traffic. Then, whoosh! A streak of shadow zipped past his window. He bolted upright, knocking over his drink. His heart pounded. No way! He raced to the glass, pressing his nose against it, scanning the sky. But whatever it was gone. Hagrid's motorcycle wasn't just any motorcycle. It had been charmed by Sirius Black, designed for speed and flight. It could climb higher than any Muggle aircraft, dive faster than a bird, but even magic had its limits. The sheer force of its acceleration sent ripples of turbulence through the air. If anyone had been watching the Thames that night, they might have noticed the sudden, violent shift in the water's surface, like a jet passing overhead. A constable on night patrol sat idly in his squad car, sipping lukewarm tea. It was a slow shift, nothing unusual, until his radio crackled. "Dispatch, we've got reports of an unidentified airborne object over Surrey." He frowned, adjusting the volume. A deep voice came through, bemused but serious. "Some lunatic on a motorcycle, if you can believe that." The officer sighed, probably a prank call. He set his tea down, stepping out for a stretch. Meanwhile, on the upper floors of a high-rise apartment building, a woman in a silk robe leaned over her balcony. She was lighting a cigarette when a sudden gust nearly blew it from her fingers. Annoyed, she glanced up and froze. There it was, a man on a motorcycle, flying. She let out a small strangled noise, stepping back. By the time she gathered herself and looked again, the night was empty. Hagrid, oblivious to the growing number of near sightings, pressed forward. The city twinkled beneath him, cars no more than fireflies in a concrete web. He needed to get to the countryside where the lights faded, where no prying eyes could follow. "Almost there, Harry," he muttered. The baby stirred. Far below, at an all-night diner, a group of friends lingered over their coffees. One of them, a wiry young man in a leather jacket, happened to glance out the window. His eyes widened. "What the hell?" His friends turned. "What?" he pointed. "I swear I just saw a giant dude on a motorbike, flying." They burst into laughter. "Right! And I saw Elvis at the petrol station." He frowned, looking back. Had he imagined it? Had it been a bird, a weird shadow? His brain scrambled for explanations. Because a flying motorcycle was impossible. Hagrid, ever confident in Dumbledore's plan, never once considered the consequences of his dramatic exit. To him, the night was a cloak, hiding him from prying eyes. But shadows cast light, and people see more than they think. The problem was never invisibility. The problem was disbelief. The Ministry of Magic must have scrambled. Obliviators dispatched, memories wiped clean. Someone had to clean up the mess. A few Muggles might have woken up the next morning, remembering something strange, but the memory would fade like a half-forgotten dream. Years later, stories lingered. The man who had dropped his keys still told the tale of the thing he saw in the sky. The boy by the window sometimes sketched motorcycles with wings. The woman on the balcony laughed about it at parties, though sometimes in the dead of night she wasn't so sure she had imagined it. Hagrid never thought twice. To him, the flight was a mission. To the Muggles below, it was a mystery, and sometimes mysteries are the most powerful magic of all. The night sky above Scotland should have been quiet, still. Instead, it was ablaze with flashing lights, green and red jets of magic slashing through the darkness. The air shook with the force of explosions, the very ground trembling under the weight of giants' footsteps. The Battle of Hogwarts was not just a secret duel between wizards. It was an all-out war, and it should have been impossible for the Muggle world not to notice. A lone backpacker had been hiking through the Scottish Highlands that evening. He was miles from the nearest town, but he wasn't lost, just looking for a quiet place to set up camp. Then, out of nowhere, the sky ahead of him erupted in a flash of green. A second later, a fiery explosion lit up the horizon, followed by a low, distant rumble. He stopped in his tracks. His heart pounded. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone. No service. The explosions didn't stop. He stared, watching in shock as streaks of blue and yellow light shot upwards, twisting through the air like lightning. A deep roar followed, a sound so unnatural, so earth-shakingly loud, that it sent shivers down his spine. He had seen fireworks before. This was no celebration. Nearer to the village of Hogsmeade, a small group of locals had been drinking at the Three Broomsticks. The war had barely touched them yet, though whispers of Voldemort's return had spread like wildfire. But that night, the war arrived on their doorstep. Madame Rosmerta stepped outside to close the shutters when she saw it. A blinding golden light burst from the direction of the castle, illuminating the sky like a second sun. She gasped, shading her eyes. Then came the shock wave, a burst of hot wind that rattled every window in the village. The ground shook. Something massive had exploded. Further down the cobbled streets, a Muggle couple travelling through the Highlands had stopped their car for the night. Their plan was simple: rest, wake up early, and continue their scenic drive. They had no idea they had parked just a few miles from Hogwarts. The first explosion made them jolt awake. The woman grabbed her partner's arm. "Did you hear that?"
Another boom, then a shrieking sound that seemed to echo through the hills. The man sat up, rubbing his face. Maybe a storm? But there were no clouds, just eerie flashes of light pulsing against the darkness.
Back at the castle, Neville Longbottom stood on the bridge, panting, gripping the sword of Gryffindor. He had just slain Nagini, and Voldemort's forces were breaking. The castle was crumbling. Massive sections of stone tumbled down, crashing into the black lake below. Dust rose into the air like smoke from a battlefield. At the edge of the forbidden forest, a dragon, Charlie Weasley's doing no doubt, roared as it lifted into the sky. Its wings beat heavily, sending whirlwinds through the treetops. Sparks flew from its nostrils, lighting the sky like shooting stars. Harry, bruised and bleeding, stood facing Voldemort in the courtyard. Their final duel was no quiet affair. The moment their wands connected, the shockwave could be felt for miles. Muggles who had been sleeping peacefully in distant villages awoke with a start, feeling the tremor as if an earthquake had rattled through their homes. An elderly farmer miles away stepped onto his porch with a lantern. The sky shimmered unnaturally. A glow unlike anything he had ever seen flickered across the hills. He muttered to himself, shaking his head. The spells weren't silent. Voldemort's screams echoed through the air as he lost control. The high, inhuman shriek could be heard even in Hogsmeade. Those who had lived through the First War felt a chill run down their spines. He was dying. The final explosion sent a ring of golden energy bursting from the heart of the castle. The Dark Lord was gone. But Hogwarts was in ruins. Ministry officials arrived within minutes. Obliviators flooded the surrounding areas, casting memory charms as fast as they could. But how could they possibly erase everything? Tourists had taken pictures of the strange lights in the sky. Some had even filmed blurry videos of enormous shapes moving through the clouds.
A local radio station received an anonymous call. A breathless hiker claimed he had witnessed something huge, some kind of secret military test, maybe even aliens. The host laughed, brushing it off as nonsense.
Yet, in the following weeks, strange rumors circulated. A few blurry images appeared on obscure websites. They showed what looked like a castle engulfed in smoke. Another had a streak of green light cutting through the sky. The official explanation was an underground gas explosion in a remote area of the Highlands. No casualties, the reports claimed, just a natural phenomenon. But some people knew better. A few villagers in Hogsmeade whispered about what they had really seen. They spoke of giants swinging clubs the size of trees, of werewolves, of fire-breathing creatures, of men and women battling with nothing but sticks in their hands, yet commanding the elements themselves. Most would forget, most would believe the official story, but there would always be those who, on some level, knew the truth. And that, perhaps, was the greatest act of magic of all. The moment Harry stumbled out of the fireplace, he knew something was wrong. The air was thick, damp, carrying the scent of mould and something more sinister, burnt wood, old parchment, decay. Shadows clung to the narrow alley, stretching unnaturally under the flickering light of ancient lanterns. He had never been here before. This wasn't Diagon Alley. His glasses were crooked, covered in soot. He adjusted them quickly, blinking as he took in the sight before him. A towering, skeletal man in a tattered cloak shuffled past, his long fingers clutching a bundle wrapped in dirty fabric. A hunched witch muttered under her breath, her teeth yellow, her fingernails blackened. Shelves inside the nearest shop window displayed skulls, vials of something dark and swirling, and a long, rusted dagger that seemed to hum in the dim light. Harry swallowed. He knew where he was now, Nocturn Alley. In a city like London, a place like this should not exist. It wasn't hidden behind some grand enchantment, nor locked away in a secret underground chamber. It was right there, attached to the very heart of Diagon Alley, steps away from the crowded, lively shops where witches and wizards bought cauldrons and schoolbooks. Even worse, it was a stone's throw from Muggle London. A businessman on his lunch break could have taken a wrong turn, stepping into the gloom without realizing. A lost tourist, distracted by an old building, could have wandered too far. And yet no one ever seemed to notice. Just beyond the entrance to Nocturn Alley, the streets were ordinary. Londoners walked by, unaware of the world just out of their reach. A young couple held hands, sipping coffee as they browsed shop windows. A cyclist weaved through traffic, his mind focused on nothing but the road ahead. But if anyone had truly looked, really looked, they might have seen something strange. A narrow passageway darker than the rest, a turn that most people instinctively avoided without knowing why. Perhaps an office worker, exhausted after a long day, once paused outside that entrance. Maybe he glanced inside just for a moment and saw something. An unnatural flicker of green light, the gleam of too many watching eyes in the shadows. Maybe a chill ran down his spine, his pulse quickened, and he shook his head. Just a trick of the light, just his imagination. Inside, Harry tried to move quickly. He needed to get out, find his way back to Diagon Alley, but the place felt like a labyrinth, twisting and narrowing, as if the alley itself didn't want him to leave. A deep voice rumbled from inside Borgin and Burke's. "The hand of glory, sir, gives light only to the bearer, best friend of thieves and plunderers." Harry pressed himself against the wall as Draco Malfoy entered the shop with his father. He listened, frozen, as Lucius Malfoy spoke to Mr. Borgin about certain items that needed to be discreetly removed before the ministry inspections. "You understand me, I'm sure." His voice was calm, but laced with cold authority. This was a shop openly selling cursed objects, hexed jewelry, and dangerous magical artifacts, and yet it remained standing. How? Perhaps the ministry knew, but chose to turn a blind eye, afraid to disrupt the delicate balance between order and chaos. Perhaps Nocturn Alley's existence served a purpose, letting the darkness gather in one place rather than spread uncontrolled. Or maybe, just maybe, there were enchantments even stronger than simple memory charms, spells woven into the very stones of the alleyway, pressing against the minds of Muggles, urging them to look away, to forget, Still, some must have seen something over the years. A London taxi driver working the late shift once told a story at a pub. He swore that one night while driving down Charing Cross Road, he saw a figure in a hooded cloak step from the shadows. The man raised a thin wooden stick and the streetlight above them shattered. A homeless man, sleeping in a doorway nearby, had muttered something about strange folk who came and went through that little alley, always whispering, always looking over their shoulders. A delivery boy, making his rounds with a stack of newspapers, swore he once saw a tall, thin gentleman vanish before his eyes. 1 second he was there, he told his mates. Next second, gone, like the street just swallowed him whole. But London was full of strange people and even stranger stories. It was easy to dismiss these as hallucinations, tricks of the mind. Harry finally found his way back, stepping into the bright warmth of Diagon Alley. He gasped in relief, brushing soot from his robes. The change was so stark, so immediate, that for a moment it felt like Nocturn Alley had been a dream. But it wasn't. It was real. It was always there. And for those who dared to look past the curtain, who ignored the whispers telling them to move along, nothing to see here. They might just discover that the darkest secrets of the wizarding world weren't hiding in the shadows. They were standing right there, in the middle of London. The dragon burst out of Gringotts with a deafening roar, its massive wings beating against the sky as it climbed higher and higher. Smoke and fire trailed behind it, a monstrous creature ripped straight from legend. But this was no myth. This was real, and it was flying over London. Harry gripped the dragon's rough scales, his fingers aching from the force of the wind. Ron and Hermione clung desperately behind him. The city stretched out below, rooftops, narrow streets, the snaking silver of the Thames. Skyscrapers loomed in the distance, their glass windows reflecting the fiery glow from the dragon's breath. Below, life continued as normal. Traffic crawled along the streets. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, lost in their own worlds. A double-decker bus stopped at a red light, its passengers yawning, checking their watches, staring blankly out the windows. Then a woman gasped. A shadow impossibly large passed over the street. Her husband, sipping his coffee, followed her gaze. "What's wrong?" She pointed. Above them, against the pale morning sky, something was moving. Something enormous. A businessman crossing the street heard it first, a deep, guttural roar that sent a shiver down his spine. He stopped mid-step, looking up just as the dragon's wings flapped, sending ripples through the clouds. His briefcase slipped from his fingers. On a rooftop terrace, a group of office workers enjoying their coffee break stared, slack-jawed. One of them fumbled for his phone. "Tell me you see this," he whispered.
A cyclist wobbled, nearly falling as the great beast soared overhead. Drivers in the streets honked angrily as the traffic light turned green, but no one moved. Heads craned upward. A delivery man stepped out of his truck, shading his eyes.
The dragon let out another roar. Somewhere in a crowded cafe, a mother clutched her child tighter, whispering, "It's just a plane, sweetheart." A security guard stationed outside the Shard spoke into his radio, his voice shaking. We might have a situation here." Inside an office building, a journalist turned from his laptop, frowning. His colleagues had rushed to the windows. "You guys are acting like you've never seen a—" He trailed off as his eyes caught the impossible sight. "Bloody hell!" Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dragon was gone. A few more powerful wing beats, a dive into a thick patch of clouds, and it vanished beyond the city. Silence fell. People exchanged nervous glances. A man in a black suit adjusted his tie. "Military test, probably," he muttered, as if saying it aloud made it true. "Must have been a trick of the light," said another. But some people knew better. A teenage girl, on the top deck of a bus, sat frozen, gripping her phone. She had filmed the whole thing. She stared at the screen, heart racing. It was all there, the scales, the wings, the fire. She glanced around. Should she post it? Before she could decide, two men in dark robes appeared beside her.
"Excuse us, miss," one of them said, raising his wand.
In a tiny bookshop near Piccadilly, an elderly man turned to his friend. "Did you see that?" His friend chuckled, shaking his head. "You've been reading too much Tolkien." The Ministry of Magic had to move fast. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Muggles had seen the dragon. The Obliviators must have worked through the night, wiping memories, erasing footage, twisting reality back into something explainable.
But not everyone forgot.
Somewhere in a darkened room, a scientist stared at the radar screen, puzzled. A massive, unidentified flying object had appeared for mere minutes before disappearing. He checked the data again. No aircraft could move like that. A retired Royal Air Force pilot, hearing the news, frowned. "Dragons," he muttered under his breath. No one heard him. But he knew. The Millennium Bridge had always been a symbol of modern London, a sleek steel structure stretching over the Thames, connecting St. Paul's Cathedral with the Tate Modern. On any given evening, it was filled with tourists snapping photos, joggers weaving through crowds, and workers heading home after a long day. No one expected disaster, no one saw it coming. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of city life. Below the bridge, boats glided through the dark water, their lights flickering like fireflies. The city's heartbeat was steady, London eternal and unfazed. Then the first shadow appeared. A man in a long trench coat walked briskly across the bridge, a briefcase in hand, mind preoccupied with numbers and meetings. He hardly noticed the sudden hush in the air. It wasn't until he exhaled and saw his own breath, off in July, that he slowed his steps. A shiver ran down his spine. Further along, a group of university students laughed, their conversation lively, carefree. One of them, blonde, wearing a leather jacket, paused mid-sentence, eyes drawn to the sky. "What the hell is that?" His friends followed his gaze. Above them, dark shapes twisted through the air. Cloaked figures gliding as if they were one with the night itself. The steel beneath their feet vibrated. A woman jogging in the opposite direction slowed, adjusting her headphones. She felt it too. The unnatural groan of metal under strain. The shift in the air. Across the river, a bartender stepped outside for a cigarette, leaning against the railing of an open-air terrace. He flicked his lighter, shielding it from the wind, but then he stopped. The wind wasn't blowing, the air was still, suffocating, heavy. He turned his head toward the bridge just as the first jet of green light slashed through the sky. His cigarette slipped from his fingers.
On the bridge, chaos erupted.
The first tendrils of black mist curled around the suspension cables, slithering like living things. The bridge moaned in protest. Another bolt of sickly green light flashed overhead. A sickening crack echoed through the night. Screams broke the silence. People ran, stumbling, colliding into one another. A father clutched his son, pulling him toward safety. A cyclist lost control, skidding onto his side. Pedestrians tripped as the steel beneath them buckled unnaturally. A businessman named Peter Langford had just stepped onto the bridge when he heard the sound, like bones snapping under pressure. He turned his head just in time to see the cables snap. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. Bridges don't just break.
Another shriek, this one not human. A monstrous, unearthly sound filled the air. Then a shadow plummeted from the sky.
The Death Eaters moved like phantoms, their robes billowing as they streaked through the darkness. Their wands slashed the air, sending curses flying. One of them laughed, a cold, cruel sound, swallowed by the wind. The bridge jerked violently. A woman in a red coat lost her footing, grabbing for the railing. It was no use. The ground beneath her tilted. She screamed as she went over the edge, her body tumbling toward the black water below. In a nearby control room, a CCTV operator blinked at his screen. The footage showed figures moving, too fast, too unnatural. His hands hovered over the keyboard. "What the hell?" He reached for the radio. We might have a..." The feed went black, static. Back on the bridge, metal groaned, cables snapped, and stone crumbled. The elegant structure tilted further, like a wounded animal struggling to remain standing. A man in a passing taxi pointed through the window. "Look at that!" The driver followed his gaze, his foot hovering over the brake. At first, it seemed like a trick of the lights. Then he saw it, the bridge, moving, shaking like it was caught in an earthquake. From the upper deck of a double-decker bus, a young woman gasped. She reached for her phone, pressing record. "Is anyone else seeing this?" The Ministry of Magic must have been scrambling. The collapse of a major landmark was one thing. The presence of Death Eaters in the heart of London was another. A police boat patrolling the Thames turned sharply, the officers on board gripping the railing as waves crashed against the hull. They watched, eyes wide, as massive chunks of debris rained down into the river. The Death Eaters circled once more, their mission complete. Their figures shimmered for a moment before vanishing entirely. The unnatural cold lifted. The sky was silent, but the bridge was gone. What had once been a proud architectural feat now lay in ruins. The central span had collapsed into the Thames, leaving only jagged remains jutting out of the water. Sirens filled the night. News agencies scrambled for answers. Reporters arrived on the scene, cameras rolling. Authorities are investigating the sudden collapse of Millennium Bridge. Early reports suggest structural failure, but eyewitnesses claim... The broadcast cut. The official explanation was swift. Structural instability, a tragic but explainable disaster. Engineers were brought in, heads shaking at the unexpected failure. But the survivors knew better. A teenage boy who had been on the bridge that night sat in his room, staring at his phone. The footage was shaky, but it was there. The shadows, the figures, the flashes of green light. He scrolled through his comments.
User 47. That's fake.
Maddie J. "No, that's edited." History, Buff 12. "Bro, you just filmed actual ghosts." Then the video disappeared. The bartender, who had stepped outside for a cigarette, found himself lying on his couch the next morning, unable to remember how he got there. The woman on the double-decker bus. She woke up convinced she had dreamed it all. The CCTV operator returned to work the next evening. The footage from that night was gone, erased. "Technical glitch," they told him. He nodded, but he didn't believe it. The Ministry of Magic had done its job. Memory charms were powerful, but some memories lingered. A fisherman sitting by the river that night swore he had seen dark shapes moving through the sky. He told his brother. His brother laughed. "You been drinking?" A conspiracy theorist blogged about it, calling it a government experiment. The post was deleted within hours.
And so the world moved on. The Millennium Bridge would be rebuilt. The city would heal. People would forget.
But for those who had seen the impossible, there would always be a quiet question in the back of their minds. What really happened that night? The Forbidden Forest had always been a place of mystery. Its ancient trees stretched high, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. Shadows clung to the trunks, twisting and shifting even when no wind stirred. It was a place whispered about in Hogsmeade, a place where creatures moved unseen, where the ordinary laws of nature bent to something older, wilder. But on one particular evening, the forest was disturbed by something big. The sound came first. A low, rhythmic thud. The ground trembled slightly with each step. In the underbrush, smaller creatures scattered, sensing the approach of something that didn't belong. Birds, usually nesting at this hour, suddenly erupted from the treetops in a flurry of wings. A man named Edward Clark was out for a nighttime hike near the edges of the forbidden forest. He wasn't a tourist. He lived in the area, had grown up in a small village nearby. He had always heard the warnings, "Don't go near the trees after dark." But Edward never believed in ghost stories. He liked the quiet, the way the woods smelled at night, the way the stars looked without the glare of city lights. That was until he heard the crash. Something massive was moving through the forest. Branches snapped like twigs. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the air, something between a grunt and a sigh. Edward froze. His flashlight flickered as his hands trembled. His mind raced. A bear? A stag? No, bigger. Then, through the break in the trees, he saw it. A towering figure, hunched slightly as it trudged forward, its massive shoulders rolling with each step. Its skin, pale and rough, caught the moonlight in patches where it wasn't covered in dirt and leaves. Thick, wild hair fell over its enormous face, partially obscuring two dark eyes that glinted like wet stones.
Edward wanted to run. His body screamed at him to move, but he couldn't. His brain refused to process what he was looking at. He had seen tall men before, sure, but this was not a man.
The creature turned its head slightly. It sniffed the air, grumbled something unintelligible, then reached out and grabbed a nearby tree trunk. With terrifying ease, it ripped a thick branch from it, examined it, then let it drop with a thud that sent a shockwave through the ground. Edward's heart hammered. He stumbled back, his foot snapping a twig. The giant's head whipped toward the sound. Edward barely had time to react. The moment those dark eyes locked onto him, he turned and bolted. His flashlight swung wildly, bouncing light off trunks and roots as he ran. The forest floor was uneven, but fear propelled him forward. Behind him he heard another grunt, a confused one. He didn't stop running until he reached the road. The next day, Edward tried to tell someone what he had seen. He walked into a pub in Hogsmeade, sat at the bar, and downed a pint before speaking. "Oh, you're not going to believe this," he told the bartender. The man behind the counter, a wizard named Thomas Knott, raised an eyebrow. "Try me." Edward hesitated. The words felt ridiculous even in his own mind, but he had to say them.
"I saw a giant."
There was a pause, then Thomas chuckled. "You mean like a really tall bloke?" Edward shook his head. "No, I mean huge. 15 feet at least." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "In the woods, near the castle." Thomas's smile faded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas leaned in slightly. "You didn't see anything," he said quietly. His voice had changed. The casual friendliness was gone. "Understand?" Edward frowned. "But I did." Thomas's grip tightened around the glass he was cleaning. "No, mate, you didn't." That night, Edward had trouble sleeping. He kept hearing the sound, the heavy footfalls, the guttural muttering. In the morning, he barely remembered what had happened. It was hazy, like a dream he couldn't quite hold on to. But some things couldn't be erased. A group of local kids, daring each other to explore the forest's edge, had found something strange a few days later. Footprints. Huge ones pressed deep into the soft earth. A woman on the outskirts of town reported that her shed had been destroyed overnight. Like something sat on it, she told her neighbors. And then there were the rumors, stories whispered in pubs, shared in hushed voices between villagers. Something's in the woods, they'd say. Something big. Of course, most dismissed it. Probably a bear, they'd shrug, or a trick of the light. But every so often, on the quietest nights when the wind carried strange echoes from the trees, the villagers would lock their doors just a little earlier, just in case. The evening had been warm, thick with the scent of cut grass and pavement still radiating the heat of the summer sun. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. It was the kind of night where windows remained open, where the hum of distant conversations and laughter drifted lazily through the quiet streets. Until it all changed. The temperature dropped in an instant. A biting cold swept through little Whinging like a silent wave, erasing the warmth of the day. The streetlights flickered, then dimmed, then went out completely. The sky, which had been a deep indigo just moments before, now looked wrong, swallowed by a darkness unnatural even for night. Mrs. Fig had just locked her door for the evening when she felt it. The air around her stiffened, thickened, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Her fingers, curled around the doorknob, ached from the sudden cold. She frowned, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. Something was very, very wrong. Down the street, an elderly man named George Leland was sitting on his front porch, a half-finished crossword resting on his lap. He had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 40 years, knew its patterns, its sounds. He was used to the occasional summer blackout, but this was different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His breath came out in a cloud. He rubbed his arms, but no warmth returned. His house was just a few steps away, but suddenly he felt as though he didn't want to move. A shrill, distant cry cut through the silence. George flinched, eyes narrowing toward the alleyway between the houses. He had seen 2 boys go that way earlier, Potter and the Dursley kid. The cry came again, muffled, choked. At that moment, something massive and shapeless glided past his yard. He didn't see it. No, his mind refused to make sense of it. But he felt it. The air turned heavy, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. The street, the houses, everything around him blurred at the edges. A distant echo of something. Laughter, his wife's voice a moment from decades ago, surfaced in his mind, only to be drowned by a crushing emptiness.
He gasped, staggering back. His cane slipped from his hand, clattering against the pavement.
Inside a nearby house, a woman named Rachel Porter had been washing dishes when the temperature in her kitchen plummeted. The window above the sink frosted over. She frowned, wiping at the glass with her sleeve, but the ice reformed instantly.
A sharp knock came at her front door, then another, and another. Her stomach twisted. Who would be knocking this late?
She turned off the tap and hesitated before stepping toward the door. Another knock. Harder this time. A slow, rhythmic pounding. Her fingers hovered over the handle, but something inside her screamed, "Don't open it." Her porch light flickered once, then went dark. Meanwhile, in the alleyway, the attack had begun. Dudley Dursley, who had never felt fear a day in his life, was curled on the ground, shaking violently. His skin was pale, his breath shallow. His eyes, glassy, unfocused, stared at something only his mind could see. Harry stood above him, heart hammering against his ribs. He knew this feeling. The choking, clawing cold. The memories vanishing one by one. The way despair coiled in his stomach like a living thing. A Dementor loomed before him, its decayed hands stretching forward. Its breath, ragged, unnatural, was the only sound in the suffocating silence. Harry's grip tightened on his wand. "Expecto Patronum!" A burst of light, brilliant and silver, exploded from the tip. A stag erupted forward, its antlers cutting through the darkness, sending the Dementor reeling. The alley was flooded with an otherworldly glow, casting sharp shadows along the brick walls. Inside her house, Rachel Porter saw it. A light, so bright, so pure, it cut through the unnatural dark like a knife. It pulsed once, twice, before fading. And then silence. Her heart pounded in her chest. She stepped back from the door. In his bedroom, a boy named Samuel woke with a start. He sat up, blinking blearily, his room bathed in an eerie silver glow. He rushed to his window just in time to see something huge, dark, shifting, vanish into the sky. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. But when he opened the camera, the street was normal again. George Leland, still gasping for breath, felt warmth return to his bones. The streetlights flickered back on, one by one. The night no longer felt wrong. He looked toward the alley. It was empty now. The next morning, Little Whinging was normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping. Rachel Porter barely remembered the light. Samuel couldn't recall why he had woken up. George Leland, still sitting on his porch, stared at his hands, wondering why they were shaking. The obliviators had done their work, but some things lingered. Rachel still felt uneasy walking past her front door at night. Samuel sometimes woke up with the memory of cold breath against his neck, but no reason why.
And George Leland?
He stopped sitting outside after dark. The night sky above the Hogwarts grounds stretched wide and endless, its inky darkness pierced only by the pale glow of the moon. The castle stood silent, its towers and turrets bathed in silver light, unaware of the two figures racing against time. Harry and Hermione, hearts pounding, clung tightly to the magnificent creature beneath them, Buckbeak, the proud and powerful hippogriff. With a powerful thrust of his wings, Buckbeak launched into the air. The rush of wind stole the breath from Harry's lungs as the ground fell away beneath them. Hermione gasped, tightening her grip around Harry's waist. The forbidden forest became a sea of black shadows below, the castle shrinking with every beat of Buckbeak's massive wings.
Higher, faster. They soared above the treetops, the world below a blur of rolling hills and twisting rivers. The wind roared in their ears, tearing through their hair, but neither dared to loosen their hold. Harry risked a glance down. The school was already far behind them, and beyond that, the dark expanse of the Scottish Highlands stretched in every direction.
But Hogwarts, hidden by powerful magic, was not the only place in the region. Beyond the mountains, beyond the vast wilderness, lay small Muggle villages, isolated clusters of cottages, their lights glowing like distant stars. And while Hogwarts itself remained unseen to non-magical eyes, Buckbeak did not. Miles away, in the quiet village of Invergarry, an elderly man named Robert McCallan stood on his back porch, nursing a cup of tea. He had lived in the Highlands his entire life, knew every sound the land made. The hoot of an owl, the rustling of deer through the brush, nothing surprised him. Until tonight. A shadow passed overhead, swift and massive, blocking the moon for just a heartbeat. Robert frowned, squinting into the sky. He wasn't a young man anymore, but his eyes were still sharp. Whatever that had been, it wasn't an airplane. It wasn't a bird either. It was something else. Further down the road, a teenager named Elliot Fraser was lying on the grass in his family's small garden, his camera beside him. He loved taking pictures of the night sky, trying to capture the way the stars seemed to stretch forever. His camera lens was pointed upward when he saw it.
A shape, no, a creature. Large wings outstretched, moving fast.
Elliot barely had time to react. He grabbed his camera, fingers fumbling over the settings. He pressed the shutter. Once. Twice. Then the creature was gone, swallowed by the night. His hands trembled as he reviewed the images. The first was blurry, nothing but streaks of black and silver. But the second his breath caught, a silhouette against the moon, unmistakable, broad wings feathered but powerful, and on its back 2 figures. He sat up quickly, heart pounding. He knew what owls looked like, what hawks and eagles looked like. This was not an owl. At a petrol station just outside Fort Augustus, a truck driver named Daniel Higgins stepped out of his cab, stretching his arms after hours on the road. He yawned, reaching for his flask, when something in the sky caught his attention.
A bird? No, too big. Far too big.
He rubbed his eyes, convinced he was overtired. But there it was again, moving against the clouds. And for a second, just a second, he swore he saw legs.
Bloody hell, he muttered.
Inside the station, a cashier named Moira had been staring at the security camera feed. She hadn't been paying much attention. Nothing interesting ever happened this late at night. But then, in the upper left corner of the screen, something flashed by.
A blur. Wings!
She rewound the footage, slowing it down. Her stomach dropped. The creature was massive, unlike anything she had ever seen. It glided over the hills, moving with unnatural grace. For a moment, she thought she saw something clinging to its back. She reached for her phone, snapped a picture of the screen. Just as she did, the camera feed went dark. A flicker, then static. Back in the sky, Hermione's grip on Harry's robes tightened as Buckbeak dipped suddenly, adjusting to the wind currents. "We're going too high!" she shouted over the roar of the wind. "We have to get farther away," Harry called back. He could barely feel his hands anymore from holding on so tightly. Buckbeak, however, had no hesitation. He was built for the sky, for freedom. With every wing beat, he carried them farther from Hogwarts, from the dangers behind them. The lake below shimmered in the moonlight, and beyond it, the lights of small villages dotted the landscape. They weren't invisible, and someone, somewhere, had to be watching. At a railway station in Speen Bridge, an older woman named Margaret sat alone on a bench, waiting for the last train of the night. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, staring absent-mindedly at the sky. Then, suddenly she wasn't alone. The light above her flickered as a deep shadow passed over. She looked up, just in time to see it. A winged beast, silent and graceful, moving against the stars. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she forgot how to move. Then the train's horn blared, and when she looked again, the sky was empty. Miles away, a young boy named Callum sat in the back seat of his parents' car, staring out the window. He was half asleep, the rhythm of the road lulling him into a daze, when something moved in the darkness. A great shadow gliding over the hills. He sat up straight, pressing his face against the glass. Mum, look!" His mother, distracted by the road, barely glanced up. "What is it, love?" But it was already gone. High above, Buckbeak finally began to descend. His great wings slowed their furious beating, angling toward a clearing just beyond the tree line. Harry and Hermione held their breath as the ground rushed up to meet them. Then, impact. A powerful jolt as Buckbeak landed, his talons digging into the earth. They had made it. As the two of them slid off his back, shaky but relieved, Hermione let out a breathless laugh.
"We did it," she whispered.
But even as they stood there, catching their breath, miles away, people were still staring at the sky. A security guard in a remote observatory rubbed his eyes, certain he had just imagined something impossible. A hiker, miles from civilization, stood frozen in place, convinced he had seen a beast from legend. And a teenage boy, staring at the grainy image on his camera screen, whispered, "What was that?" Somewhere, in the offices of the Ministry of Magic, alarms were likely going off. Memory charms would be used, reports would be filed. But no amount of magic could erase the feeling that for a brief moment something incredible had flown across the night sky. The morning of the second task dawned crisp and cold, mist curling over the black lake like ghostly fingers. The surface of the water was still, reflecting the towering castle and the crowd of students gathering along the shore. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. 4 champions stood at the water's edge, hearts pounding, waiting for the signal to begin. Beyond the magical boundaries of Hogwarts, however, the world carried on as usual. The nearby villages, nestled in the Scottish Highlands, were home to Muggles who had lived there for generations. Some had always felt that something was off about that castle in the distance, but they never dwelled on it. A private school, perhaps, a historical site, nothing more. But that morning, something caught their attention. A fisherman named Thomas McGregor had been out early, his boat bobbing gently on the lake's far edge. He had fished these waters for years, knew every ripple, every current. But today the lake felt different. The air was heavy, pressing against his chest. His dog, curled in the boat beside him, whined softly. Then movement. 4 figures stood by the water, too far away for him to see their faces, but close enough that he could tell something was about to happen. Behind them, a massive crowd had gathered. Thomas frowned. Why were so many people standing at the lake's edge? What kind of school activity required students to line up like spectators at a sporting event? Then the whistle blew. The 4 figures plunged into the lake. Thomas sat up straight. He had seen plenty of people swim in these waters before, but never like this. They didn't wade in, they didn't hesitate. They disappeared completely. The water barely rippled as they vanished beneath the surface. His dog barked, ears flat against its head. Something wasn't right. In a nearby hiking lodge, a group of tourists sat by the window, sipping coffee and watching the distant view of the lake. One of them, a woman named Fiona, leaned closer. "That's odd," she murmured. Her husband glanced up. "What?" She pointed. "Look, those kids just jumped in. No splashing, no movement. They just vanished." Her husband chuckled. Probably some kind of competition. Open water diving, maybe? But Fiona kept watching. Something about the scene unsettled her. Then something broke the surface. A flash of silver, a glimmer of a tail. Her heart skipped a beat. Did I just see? A second later it was gone. Thomas, still in his boat, rubbed his eyes. He had seen it too, a sleek shape moving just beneath the surface, far too large to be a fish. And then another, a webbed hand, a long tail. He shook his head. His mind must be playing tricks on him. But before he could process it, the singing began. The eerie, lilting song drifted across the water, carrying a strange melody that made his skin crawl. It wasn't English. It wasn't Gaelic. It was something else. Something older. His dog let out a low growl. Farther up the shoreline, an elderly man named Angus stood by his shed, polishing his fishing rod. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he felt the song more than he heard it. The hairs on his arms stood up. From his porch, he had a perfect view of the castle grounds. He could see the massive gathering of students, the strange tension in the air, the way they all stood, breathless, eyes locked on the lake. He had lived near this place for decades. He had never seen anything like this. Then the water exploded. A massive spray shot into the air as something breached the surface. A figure, gasping for breath, scrambling toward the shore, then another and another. The champions were returning. From his boat, Thomas saw them too. 4 teenagers, drenched, exhausted, dragging themselves onto the shore. The crowd erupted in cheers. Thomas didn't move, because behind them, just beneath the surface, something else was watching. A pair of eyes, large, unblinking, hovered just below the waves. Then, with a flick of a long, scaled tail, it was gone. Thomas sat frozen, his hands gripping the edges of his boat. His dog whined, nudging his leg. The cheers from the shore faded into the wind. He knew what he had seen, and yet, by the next morning, he could barely remember why it had seemed strange. The hikers, the tourists, the villagers, all of them recalled a vague sense of unease. But the details? Blurred, like trying to hold on to a dream after waking up. The Ministry of Magic had cleaned up the mess. Memory charms were efficient, but not perfect, and some stories refused to be forgotten. The battle had been raging for what felt like hours. The sky above Hogwarts churned with unnatural clouds, thick and pulsing with the remnants of dark magic. Fires smouldered in the rubble of collapsed towers, their embers flickering in the night. The once proud castle stood battered, its walls cracked, its great halls filled with the wounded and the fallen. The war had come to its final moment. In the middle of the destruction, in the heart of the great hall's courtyard, two figures stood apart from the chaos. One, a boy, scarred, exhausted, barely standing but resolute. The other, a monstrous shadow of a man, his once fearsome presence reduced to desperation. Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort faced each other at last. The onlookers, survivors, fighters, children, held their breath. Wands were clutched tightly, but no one moved. No one dared to interfere. Then the magic erupted. A blinding flash of green collided with a bolt of brilliant gold. The sheer force of it sent a shockwave through the courtyard. The very air trembled. A deafening crack split the night like thunder. The cobblestones beneath them shattered, sending shards of rock flying in all directions. In a small village miles beyond the castle, a woman named Margaret sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound had jolted her awake. Her window rattled violently as if an explosion had gone off nearby. She turned to her husband, but he was already sitting up, frowning toward the hills in the distance.
"Did you hear that?" she whispered.
"Aye," he muttered, pulling back the curtains. But the night was calm, too calm. Back at the castle, Harry and Voldemort circled each other. Their wands crackled with magic, raw energy distorting the air around them. "You are too late, Potter," Voldemort hissed. "I am eternal." But Harry shook his head. "No, you've already lost." Voldemort lunged, his wand slashing through the air. Another explosion of light burst between them. The force of the spells colliding sent a massive gust of wind outward, rattling the trees of the forbidden forest, sending loose stones tumbling from the castle's broken towers. At that very moment, in a nearby town, a young man named Daniel was walking home from his shift at the pub. He had just crossed a small bridge when a sudden gust of wind nearly knocked him off balance. The trees lining the river bent unnaturally, the air humming with something he couldn't quite explain. His skin prickled.
"What the hell was that?" he muttered.
Behind him, an old man sitting on a bench lifted his head, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. "Something's happening," he murmured. Back at the castle, the duel reached its climax. Voldemort raised his wand for one final killing curse, his mouth twisted in rage, in fear, in defiance.
"Avada Kedavra."
Harry's wand moved faster.
"Expelliarmus!"
The two spells met in mid-air, twisting around each other, fighting for dominance. The force of it knocked both duelists backward. Voldemort staggered, his wand flying from his grasp. His red eyes widened in shock. Then it happened. A ripple of magic, deeper than anything before, pulsed outward. The ground trembled, the castle groaned, and Voldemort, Lord of Darkness, the monster who had haunted the wizarding world for decades, began to dissolve. It started at his fingertips, his pale, snake-like hands crumbling into dust. His robes fluttered wildly as his form began to disintegrate, caught in the wind like dying embers. The remaining Death Eaters gasped. Some tried to run, others fell to their knees, their wands slipping from their fingers. In the village, Margaret's husband squinted toward the hills. "Look at that," he said, voice tight. Margaret followed his gaze. A strange shimmer in the distance, something in the air, almost like a dust storm, but too high, too wrong. The stars above it seemed to flicker. In the sky above Hogwarts, Voldemort let out a final, inhuman scream. His face twisted, his body breaking apart. His scream became the wind, stretching over the hills, reaching the valleys beyond. Then silence. The dust of the Dark Lord scattered into the night. The battle was over. The castle was still standing. Barely. The great hall had lost part of its ceiling, and the once grand stone archways were cracked and broken. But Hogwarts remained. Harry lowered his wand, his chest rising and falling heavily. Around him the survivors began to stir, blinking in disbelief. Whispers spread, then cries of joy, of sorrow, of relief. From the edge of the forest a man stood watching. He was no wizard, just a hiker who had been passing through, drawn toward the castle by something he didn't understand. His camera, slung around his neck, had captured something in those last moments. A burst of light, a swirling figure, a face contorted in agony before vanishing completely. But when he checked his camera later, the image was blurred, unfocused, as if reality itself had rejected it. In the nearby town, an old woman sat outside her home, listening to the wind. She had lived there for decades, seen storms, heard the rolling thunder of the highlands. But she had never heard a sound quite like that before. A sound like something ending. The next morning, the Ministry of Magic would move quickly. Memory charms, altered records, Muggle media would explain the strange tremors as minor earthquakes, the flashes of light as atmospheric disturbances. But not everyone would forget. Margaret, sitting at her kitchen table, would find herself staring at the hills again, tracing the distant silhouette of the castle with narrowed eyes. Daniel, the young man who had felt the strange wind, would wake up with an odd sense of certainty that something had changed. And the hiker, flipping through his camera's empty memory, would wonder why he could still hear a faint, distant whisper every time he closed his eyes. A whisper on the wind.
Voldemort was gone.
But magic had left its mark.